All right, well, today we get to one of the sections of Revelation that many people think of when they think of Revelation, and that is the locusts, which we will get to relatively soon. As you can tell, this time I don't have any sort of PowerPoint presentation, and that is largely because I'm not sure how to illustrate that. You can read it for yourself and see that it's somewhat self-explanatory, and at the same time a bit difficult to try to put to a sort of image or idea of what you're looking at. So instead of doing that, I figured I would go through the text as it's kind of given here, because one of the things I was thinking about this last week was we see a lot of different things in the news, and we read a lot of different things, and it's hard sometimes to put the pieces together. It's very easy to generally collect information and kind of have little sort of reminders periodically, but hard to really put it down on paper. And so I was going over some of the earlier sections of Revelation and just trying to reorient myself with the whole context. And one of the things that has just always stood out to me is earlier in Revelation, back in chapters 4 and 5, you see the Father on the throne, and the Lamb approaches the throne and takes the scroll. And the thing that is said about the Father, and it's reiterated, is the same word used 3 times. And it's easy to go over that word and just kind of gloss over it because we're used to it. But we've said this before, but the angels don't say loving, loving, loving. They don't say mercy, mercy, mercy. They don't say care, care, care. They don't say any of these things. They don't even say wrath. They don't say destruction. They use the singular word holy, and they reiterate it 3 times to put an emphasis on this holiness. And this, you could argue, is one of, if not the primary attribute of God, that he is holy, because from that everything else stems. And this is the thing that they choose to emphasize. And I was thinking about that because when you look at scenes of heaven and you try to picture in your mind what heaven might look like or what an experience is like, and then you actually open the Bible and you start to read about it, you see that it's not anything anybody expects. That this scene that plays out before the throne is singularly focused on the Father, and then shifts focus to the Lamb, and then to both. And this phrase that they're saying, holy, 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 is the Lord God, the Almighty, the one who was and who is to come. And then they go on to his attributes as creator. And it's easy to read these things and just kind of miss that this isn't just being said in heaven. Look at the context in which it is being said. That this is a sort of prelude to what's about to happen. And so you can get lost in talking about the 7 seals and the trumpets and the bowls and the locusts and the Antichrist and the beast and everything, and it's easy to lose focus of the fact that this is how this section begins. And you see iterations of this show up in places like Daniel as well, where you see one like a son of man coming from the throne. You see the Ancient of Days. You see these scenes play out there as well. And the reason I bring that up is because we can get lost as well in looking at the news. I was just thinking, if you were to do an assessment of everything that has happened since the last time I spoke, so about a month ago, what has gone down in the news in the last month? And you could bring up different political things like failed debates and assassination attempts, but you can also look at just the way the world is going. Recently, as many probably are familiar with, the Olympics are going on in Paris, and they made no small attempt to illustrate their secular view. France has always been notoriously secular, and also notorious for not holding back its secularism, but just the target that they pick. There was this, in their opening display, a sort of depiction of the Last Supper, and they're trying to put all these perverts on display and trying to show how free-thinking they are, which I think, as a political move, is somewhat poor, seeing as their population is slowly being replaced by a group that would not care for that sort of lifestyle. But you see that sort of perversion on stage, and you see it displayed and flaunted, and you can get agitated at that and think, why are they doing this? How can they get away with this? And then you can see in the news the different presidential issues that are going on, and the issues that are even being discussed, or the issues that aren't being discussed. things that have now been relegated to politics and nothing more. And the people that are running into this and the subject of abortion and marriage and everything else, and easy to get frustrated by that and say, why are things the way they are? Why is the world going the way it is? What isn't it going to stop? And to get lost in being irritated by it. But every once in a while I stop and I try to put myself into a different, shall we say, viewfinder. I was watching as the current president was giving his little, I don't know what to call it, it's not a speech, his presentation to the American people the other week here. And everyone, it's one side of the aisle. Either he's a strong, heroic leader, or he's a laughing stock of an old man, and anything in between. But I was watching, and what you look at when you see this sort of a man, and this is true for anybody reaching at that point, is you see somebody who is, no matter what happens in politics, no matter what happens in the world, you see somebody who is slowly approaching the finish line, and not in a good way. And you can see someone who's falling apart mentally, somebody who's struggling to keep it together, and his last grasps at power and relevance are to try to uphold a perverted flag, an immoral society, and trying to represent a group of people that are stabbing him in the back, and he's losing his mind, and all these things are happening at once, and you're seeing someone rapidly approach the finish line. You can see this with politicians all the time, but not so close to death this often. And so, no matter what you think of his past or present, he is about to find out the truth. And when you put that into perspective, when you look at the world, and not just someone like him, the world in general, the Olympics, or the current candidates, or the moral issues, and protesters, and rioters, and Hamas, and Hezbollah, and Israel itself, just realizing that the great equalizer here is truth. And that tends to be revealed at death. That no matter what your positions are, death does not give much particular relevance. That you will quickly find out. So, all that to say that it's easy to look at the world and become irritated and forget that Revelation begins and ends with the bookends, as it were, of God's holiness and the fact that he's not trying to win. He's not eventually going to win. It's that his victory is already sealed, that they're giving their victory song at the beginning of the book, not at the end. They are at the end, but they're also getting it at the beginning. This is an open and closed subject. And so when we look at the world, and we're about to see what happens here in chapter 9, keep in mind that for all the evil that they're doing now, and will get worse, they're doing it because this is the time they have to do it. And that time is going to come to an end, either by means of natural death or means of God expediting the process by bringing judgment to the earth. So, with all that in mind, one of the other fascinating things that happened since the last time I spoke, and I was telling Jillian this the other day, I said, it's so easy to get used to it and to completely gloss over. The leader of the Jewish nation of Israel came and gave a speech before a joint session of Congress in the year 2024. That's extremely odd. One of the people say, we're just in the modern age. Nothing has actually changed. This is where the preterist really starts to run into trouble. It was infamous that when Israel became a nation and we became a Jewish nation, that there were some notable preterists who suddenly had to call into question whether or not some of these things might have been more literal than they thought. And so you watch the leader of the nation of the Jewish state of Israel come and give a speech, and in this speech he talks about establishing an Abrahamic alliance with the many, or with the nations, and you just look at that and you think, this has to be notable more than just some political speech. And so just seeing all of that, you start to realize, okay, what we're about to get into here might not just be speculation. It might not just be theology. It might not just be hermeneutic. It might be very practical, potentially in the near future. We'll find out at some point or another. So, what has happened up to this point? Fast forwarding, we're currently in the sort of flashback, and now we're going back to where we were at. In chapter 8, we had the seventh seal broken, and the first 4 trumpets blown. And in those first 4 trumpets, we covered everything that would go down. So the prayers of the saints are offered up, and the golden censer filled with fire was cast onto the earth. and a third of the earth's trees were burned up, and all of the grass and the third of the sea was turned to blood, and the ships were destroyed in it. And so you have this scene where, say you're one of these people on the earth. Say, however many years ago you were watching the 2024 Olympics in Paris, and now you're here, standing on the seashore, and the sky is dark. It's darker longer, it's darker at night, and the sea is now blood. There's all kinds of death and shipwrecks washing up onto the shore. The trees are burned up. There's no more grass. There's already been geological displacement with an earthquake that moved mountains literally. And so everything's already out of the norm. Everything's already terrifyingly different. And so all of this has happened on top of the number of deaths that have occurred up to this point. We've already pushed approximately 2 billion people. And so that means that almost everyone will know somebody who died. Statistically, it is more than likely that you're going to run into people at the store or out and about who will know somebody who succumbed to this, or people you know who succumbed to this. In other words, it's really, really close to home because it's at home. And so the world's already a mess. And this is the scene that's currently established. This is what's already in play before we ever get to chapter 9. And then chapter 9 ends in verse 13. Because people will say, well, this is the greatest tragedy that's ever befallen the face of the earth. I mean, this is the greatest geological, this is the greatest human experienced tragedy that's ever occurred on the face of the earth. And now they're picking up the pieces, trying to clean up and get back to normal. And overhead, in verse 13 there at the end of chapter 8, comes the great heavenly taunter. Then I looked, and I heard an eagle flying in mid-heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth, because of the remaining blasts of the trumpet of the 3 angels who are about to sound. So in other words, it's a reminder that this isn't even started yet. This is just the introduction to what is about to begin. And as I alluded to last time, the 7 seals appear to take over periods of years before they're finished. But the trumpets start to get faster. So using birth pangs as the illustration, the farther you get into the process, the closer they get together. So you watch the monitor that they put up at the hospital when they're watching, and there's little bumps, and every once in a while there's a bump. Well, now the bumps are getting closer, and now they're getting stronger. And so, here they're being reminded it isn't over. Then chapter 9, verse 1, no break. Woe to you who's about to hear the next trumpet, and then off he goes. The 5th angel sounded, and I saw a star from heaven which had fallen to the earth. And the key of the bottomless pit was given to him. And he opened the bottomless pit, and smoke went up out of the pit like the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened by the smoke of the pit. Then out of the smoke came locusts upon the earth, and power was given to them, as the scorpions of the earth have power. And they were told not to hurt the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, nor any tree, but only the men who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. And they were not permitted to kill anyone, but to torment for 5 months. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings a man. And in those days men will seek death and will not find it. They will long to die, and death flees from them. And the appearance of the locusts was like horses prepared for battle. And on their heads appeared to be crowns like gold, and their faces were like the faces of men. They had hair like the hair of a woman, and their teeth were like the teeth of lions. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron. And the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots, of many horses rushing to battle. And they have tails like scorpions, and stings, and in their tails is the power to hurt men for 5 months. And they have as a king over them the angel of the abyss, and his name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in the Greek he has the name Apollyon. The first woe is past. Behold, 2 woes are still coming after these things. Now, a lot of people quickly get tied up in that text on the locusts and their description because they are freaky looking. Or maybe they're symbolic. And, well, what does this mean? And what does this represent? And is this a biblical text we will run to talk about the length of men's hair? It's none of those things. We're going to get into it. We're going to try to pick it apart in a few different sections. So what I decided to do with this particular chunk here is to break it up to address each thing categorically here. And the first thing we're going to address is the angel. the king of the abyss, as he's labeled here. And the reason why is he is the first thing that comes into view. So it talks about how the fifth angel sounds and a star falls from heaven and goes to the earth. Now, the term star here, we have it translated in the English as star, but really the term has been used for things like angels. And the end of this section clearly establishes that this is referencing an angel, on top of the fact that it personifies him, that he was given the key to the bottomless pit. And so we'll look at him first. And I thought that this, to me, was far more fascinating than any of the locusts. Because the locusts, if you handle it rather plainly, there's not a great deal to speculate on them. It's actually giving you plenty of detail. But this angel, this king over the abyss, is someone we hear very little about. So I thought I would spend some time trying to break down who this is. And there's a reason for that we'll get into in a minute. And so, here are the order of the events. This is what happens. This is what the text says will go down. The fifth angel sounds the fifth trumpet. An angel, or some sort of heavenly being, descends from the heaven to the earth. He is given the key to the bottomless pit, otherwise known as the abyss. Smoke comes out and darkens the sky, and the locusts are released from the abyss to torture the inhabitants on the earth, but are not permitted to kill anyone nor harm any green thing. Okay, so the first one, who is the angel? Who is this? And this is one of those things that you open up your commentary and you just brace to read what you might find, because there is no shortage of speculation on this one. Because for the fact that he says, well, his name is Apollyon in the Greek. Okay, well, where else do you find that name? In the New Testament. If you go to your NASB, if you go to your online Bible and search it, you're not going to find it anywhere except here. So, who is this? Many believe that it is the devil. There are some very well-known people who believe this is the devil, and the reason they believe this has a few different factors. One of the main reasons is because he's seen as a star falling from heaven to the earth. And many people will run back to Isaiah chapter 14, and they will say, well, there was Lucifer, and Lucifer was the morning star who was cast out of heaven, and so this must be the devil. The other reason they believe this is that he acts as the king of the abyss, or the bottomless pit, out of which what appear to be demons fly out. And so they come out and they say, well, who else would be king over hell if not the devil? Who else is the king over the demons if not the devil? So it must be that reason. And then finally, the locusts are specifically designed to torture humanity. And, well, who else could be king over them except the adversary, except Satan, except the devil? And these are the basic reasons people give out as to why they believe that this being is the devil. However, this does not work, this explanation, for a few different reasons. First, the term star does not specifically refer to the devil. While many would go back to Isaiah chapter 12, where they believe the devil is called the morning star, is seen falling from heaven, that text does not specifically label the one in view as the devil. So if we go back there, actually, if you look at Isaiah, you would think, okay, so if this is the devil, if this is Satan in view here, well, how obvious might it be? And this is where I get to have one of my niche little conclusions that we'll get into here in a minute. But Isaiah chapter 14, there's this song or this lamentation or this sort of rebuke being given. And Isaiah chapter 14, starting at verse 1, when the Lord will have compassion on Jacob, and again choose Israel, and settle them in their own land, then strangers will join them and attach themselves to the house of Jacob. Interesting thing to say, considering the current context. The peoples will take them along and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel will possess them as an inheritance in the land of the Lord, as male servants and female servants, and they will take their captors captive, and will rule over their oppressors. Now, this would merit its own study, which we won't get into today. And it will be in that day, when the Lord gives you rest from your pain and turmoil and harsh service in which you have been enslaved, that you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. Now, there's the first thing to note. This is who they are taunting. The king of Babylon specifically is named here. And this is the only person who is named as the target of this taunt. And they will say, how the oppressor has ceased, and how the fury has ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of rulers, which is used to strike the peoples in fury with unceasing strokes, which subdued the nations in anger with unrestrained persecution. So in other words, this is a king, somebody who ruled over and basically conquered the nations and beat them down. He is seen as an oppressor, as a almost dictator. And so as a consequence, when he is removed, verse 7, the whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into shouts of joy. Even the cypress trees rejoice over you, and the cedars of Lebanon saying, since you were laid low, no tree cutter comes up against us. Sheol is from beneath, is excited over you, to meet you when you come. It arouses for you the spirits of the dead, all the leaders of the earth. It raises all the kings of the nations from their thrones. They will all respond and say to you, you have become made weak as us, and you have become like us. Your pomp and the music of your harps have been brought down to Sheol. Maggots are spread out as your bed beneath you, and worms are your covering. How you have fallen from heaven, and here's the key part that they point to. How you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. You have been cut down to the earth, you who have weakened the nations. But you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. And I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will make myself like the Most High. Nevertheless, you will be thrust down to Sheol, to the recesses of the pit. And then it continues. Now, who does this have in view here? And this is an area up for debate, and I will not be absolutely dogmatic on it, but that term, the morning star, is where we get the name Lucifer from. However, find me another text in the Bible that describes the devil as wanting to make himself like God. I know it's very well known as a matter of lore or myth, but it never really says that. Now, the devil offers this. He makes this offer many times. This is what he offers Eve in the knowledge. God knows that when you eat of it, you will become like him, knowing good and evil. So we see that. But other than that, the only other person that we are aware of distinctly who is a ruler over the nations who does this, who attempts to ascend himself up to the level of God and declares himself to be like God, it's not the devil. It's what we would refer to as the man of lawlessness. In fact, this is distinct about the man of lawlessness, that he boasts about himself. The same is said in Daniel 7. You see it again in Daniel 8, and then again in Daniel 11, that this is a man who comes up and is a king, but he exalts himself above every so-called God, above every object of worship, to the extent that he declares himself to be God. And so we then see him all the way over there in chapter 3 of 2 Thessalonians, that this man of lawlessness will declare himself to be like God. And you see this sort of description of this man over and over and over again. And so I would argue that this text there in Isaiah is more having this king in view, which would explain why he's not called the devil. He's not even called the serpent. He is referred to here as the king of Babylon. We know that the man of lawlessness will be given authority over the nations for a period of time, and he will then be dispossessed. And oddly enough, when you get down to the latter part of Revelation, and we'll get to this here in a second, the first inhabitant of the lake of fire, it's not the devil. The first inhabitant of the lake of fire is the beast from chapter 13, or you could say the man of lawlessness and the false prophet. And we'll get into that text when we get into it. But all that to say that going back to our chapter here, simply because a being that is called a star comes down from heaven, that does not inherently mean that he's the devil. So that begs a question. Who is it then? And this is where I think things start to get really interesting. This being, or star, comes down from heaven. So this is the first thing. He's coming down from heaven, and he is not being cast down to the earth as an outcast. The idea here, or the wording here, is looking at it as, like many of the stars had been falling earlier, they look up and another one comes down from heaven and lands on the earth. Only in this case, he's given a task, he's given a job. But what I thought was interesting is the way his name is given out here. John does not write down, and his name is Apollyon, which would make sense. The letter was predominantly written in Greek, and it would make sense that he would stay consistent. He just gives out the name and moves on. So why does he take the time to give the Hebrew name? Why does he specify the difference of this person's name between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Hebrew and the Greek? Why is he giving out both? This is a very specific thing that John does, and he doesn't do it anywhere else in Revelation. He doesn't give out a name and then give you the Hebrew meaning as well. So, this is a very distinct thing that John does. This would very clearly mean that this is a title John seems to think we've seen before, that he's pointing to something else, something that you're familiar with. So in other words, he says, in his name, in Greek, it would be Apollyon. But those of you who are aware, you might know his name more familiar from the Hebrew, Abaddon. And this word, this name, literally in both the Greek and the Hebrew, basically translates to destroyer, or the destroyer, or the source of destruction, which is a fascinating title that he's given here, because we have seen the destroyer referenced in the Old Testament in the Hebrew. Where have we seen this destroyer before? You might know him, as he's labeled in the Jewish Targums, as the angel of death, which, again, translates to the same wording here. He's often called the destroyer. This is alluded to in Exodus chapter 12, verse 23. Egypt, the final plague comes over them, and God tells the Israelites to do their sacrifice and to take the blood of a lamb and put it over their door, and he would send the destroyer. And the destroyer, or the angel of death, would come down, and if he went to a house, if it had the blood over the door, he would pass over it. Thus the phrase, the Passover. But if the house did not have the blood over the doorpost, he would then kill the firstborn. And he would go throughout Egypt, and that whole account goes down that way. But basically, that's pointing to God having a very particular instrument that he used in that case. And so, here in Revelation 9, John is effectively saying, his name in the Greek is Apollyon, but you know him better as the angel of death, or the destroyer in the Hebrew. This destroyer is also referenced, at least as far as the wording is used here, it appears to be referenced in 1 Corinthians 10:10, where it talks about Israel grumbling, and the phrase is put out there, and God sent the destroyer out among them. Now, one of the reasons I think that's a fascinating connection is what the destroyer does. He seems to have a, shall we say, a calling card, a pattern. I was trying to dig through history of where we might have seen him before, other than just Egypt. I think Egypt is the predominant example, but he seems to have a pattern, and we see that pattern repeated here in Revelation 9. His title as the destroyer, or cause of destruction. It was interesting because the term for destroyer shows up in a few different ways. One is just destruction. The destroyer could just mean something is being destroyed. So there's a difference between destruction itself and a personified cause. For example, the world was destroyed by means of a global flood in the days of Noah. But God also destroyed the Philistines through people like Saul and David. In this context, we see that there is some sort of being titled the destroyer. And again, John's clearly going out of his way to tell you that this is a person, a thing, a person with a name. This happened against Egypt when Pharaoh refused to let Israel go, and the same happened to Israel when they refused to obey God through Moses. The idea is that God would dispatch a spiritual being solely designed for the purpose of destruction, and this should not seem foreign to us, nor is it outside the realm of God's freedom to do so. The fact that he does not send him out more often should be the actual question as to why we don't see this guy showing up even today. And it should also be noted that this angel of death is extremely efficient. In both cases, Egypt and Israel, the deed was carried out very quickly, with the firstborn dying in the night and the Israelites being dead by tens of thousands, seen in Numbers 16. Roughly about 14,000 people died very, very quickly. In Numbers 16, we see that Korah's rebellion was brought into view as well, and the mention of the destroyer in 1 Corinthians 10 could indicate that he participated. This is just now speculation. In other words, you could be seeing his fingerprints show up there. And as you recall, the rebellious group was swiftly removed from the scene by means of the earth opening up to receive them alive into Sheol, or into hell. So, in other words, the line was drawn, and you know the story. Though Moses goes up and Korah was complaining against Moses and Aaron, and so God tells them, all right, split up, create two camps, create two sides. Korah, you and your king go over there, and everybody else over here. And whoever wants to join Korah, go and do that. And then a couple of things go down, earth opens up, they fall alive into hell, ground closes up, and that's that. Very fast, very efficient. And so the summary of his title could be seen that this is an angel from heaven, so similar to Michael or Gabriel or the cherubim, His purpose is destruction, and he is sent out to execute very specific judgments from God. He does not target people with a specific mark, and this is what I thought was interesting, and this is where I think his pattern shows up. You never see, as far as I could tell or find, you never see him going out being said, hey, go after them. Whenever he shows up in Egypt and in here and in the rebellion of Korah, they all have something in common, even with the serpents that went on among Israel. There's something in common. It wasn't target them. It was everybody but them. In other words, the distinction was made that he would take a particular group of people and not make them the target. He would move them out of the target area. So, for example, in Egypt, Israel, put the blood over your doorposts. This exempts you from what's coming. This exempts you from the sweeping judgment. Korah's rebellion, Moses and everybody with him, get away from them. Get over here. Separate yourselves from them. In the case of the serpents, look at the bronze staff and you'll be saved from this plague of this judgment. So you can see there's this sort of dividing line that constantly shows up. So in other words, it would seem that this angel is designed as a more sweeping judgment. He approaches everything with a sort of broad stroke and is more told not who to target. So you would then expect to see that in Revelation 19 the same pattern would show up. So sure enough, he goes down to the earth, he opens up the bottomless pit or the abyss, and the locusts are come out. And what are the locusts told? They're not told who to attack, they're told who not to attack. They are told not to attack those with the seal of God on their foreheads, and they're told not to attack any green thing, any tree, any of the grass. Everything else is fair game. The only other thing they're told not to do is not to kill anybody. And so you see the same pattern show up here and here and here, and I thought it was just interesting because that would explain why John is so particular about the name here in both the Greek and the Hebrew. He's effectively saying this name should ring a bell. You should know this. This angel of death that attacked Egypt is showing up here again. God's dispatching him again. He's also called the king of the locusts, apparently, the angel of the abyss. And he has been given the key to the abyss to open it up and unleash the locust, which is fitting, considering that this is his specific domain of authority. In other words, these are his. This is a sort of, I don't want to say pet, but it is a tool that he has been saving for this particular moment. Interestingly, Jesus was seen at the very start of Revelation as holding both the keys to death and Hades, which would indicate that the Lamb who broke the seventh seal and instructed the fifth angel to sound his trumpet then gave one of the keys, in this case, to the abyss, to this angel and told him to go open it. Other references might include the same angel showing up in Revelation 20. So we see the angel of the abyss show up again there. And that is where the door is once again put in view, and the dragon, who is the devil, is thrown in there, and the door is shut for 1,000 years. So he shows up there as well. So now we go to the context or the question of the abyss. What is the bottomless pit? And this one was always something that fascinated me for years, because I always imagined that it was this door somewhere that would be opened up, and it was a pit, and if you fell in there, you would never stop falling. Door would be shut, and you would just fall and fall and fall and fall and fall and fall. And the reason you conclude that is because the word bottomless is used. But that word isn't quite a good translation of what's being seen in here. So, what is this bottomless pit? Well, the wording can be broken up into two different parts. The first is the term bottomless, though that perhaps is better translated abyss or great depth. It does not directly mean it has no end to the depth of it. The better idea is to look that it is very deep. So if you looked into a deep, dark hole, you think, wow, I can't see the end. It just keeps going and going and going. That doesn't mean it doesn't have an end, but rather this is to try to put into picture how deep the hole is. It is very, very far down. It is an abyss. That's why the word abyss is used. It is very dark, it is very deep, and that is what is brought into view here. And then the other part is the term for pit. Thus we get the phrase bottomless or great depth and pit. And the term pit here is referencing more the opening. So you could say a well is like a pit. And you could look in, and inside the pit is a depth or an abyss. It's dark. And so this is the wording that's used to kind of put together the title of this particular location. You put them together and you have basically the entrance to the abyss. Where is this? Well, now we get into some really fun speculation, some really fun biblical, again, we'll just say biblical lore, something you could write down in a sort of encyclopedia and try to keep track of, because this is, I think, just truly fascinating. To understand what the abyss is, we need to look at how it is described both historically in this immediate context, because if you're familiar with the term the abyss, you know this is not the first time this word has shown up. The term for abyss is referenced many other times. So, for example, in Luke chapter 8, verse 31, the demons, Jesus is going around and casting them out. And one of them, or a group of them, depending on how you look at the word there, is just lamenting this. Often Jesus would show up to the demons and they would ask the question, what have we to do with you? What business do you have with us? Why are you here, son of David or son of God? And they knew who he was. They were very familiar with who he was, but they were familiar with something else. They were terrified that he had come to judge them or torment them before the times, the way it's worded. And they're afraid that they would be cast down to the abyss or to the pit. This is where the phrase shows up again in 2 Peter chapter 2:4, where it describes that angels who had sinned were bound up in pits of darkness, or the abyss of darkness. Basically, saying effectively that these demons, these rebellious angels, are bound up and they go into the abysses, and that's where they're kept. That is where they are restrained. And so when Jesus is going around kicking demons out of people, they're terrified that they're also going to go down there, because apparently they are aware that there are some down there already, and then they're coming soon. They reference the judgment. They know that a day is coming in which this is really going to happen. And so they're terrified of it. In Matthew chapter 8, 28 through 31, we meet the infamous Legion, a man who is filled with so many demons that they give themselves the collective title of Legion because there were many of them. And these ask Jesus if he had come to, quote, torment us before the time. And that is before then being asked if they could, or asking if they could go into the little group of pigs and run off the cliff. And so they have something in view there. And they say, and they beg Jesus to leave them alone, asking, have you come to destroy us? I know who you are. You are the Holy One of God. And so they are looking to the same torment awaiting them in pits of darkness as others that had preceded them. And so, in other words, this abyss is partially designed to house the rebellious angels who were cast down and bound up. All right, so that's already interesting enough. But then we look at the use of the word Sheol in the Old Testament. Now, the word Sheol can be used in a few different contexts. It could be referencing death in general. But sometimes it has judgment, or the place you go after you die, or the domain of death in view. So, for example, you will often see the phrase, go down to Sheol. In other words, it doesn't just say end up in Sheol, it's referencing a direction, that you will go down, you would move downwards. Now, you could view that as, well, you're buried, which would make sense, though not everyone was buried above ground. They had tombs and things like that. But the idea here was that when the word Sheol is used, it doesn't always simply just mean death, like a biological death. It's referencing the experience of death, either the process of dying or the process of being dead. For example, you know the infamous phrase, he has not abandoned my soul to Sheol. He has not left it there. So, the term Sheol has a few different use cases. But if we look at the rebellion of Korah there in Numbers 16, we see the following said. When the rebellion begins to kick off, a proposal is made about if God approves Korah and his group, or if God approves Moses and Aaron and their group. And a proposal is said, but if the Lord brings about an entirely new thing, and the ground opens its mouth and swallows them up with all that is theirs, and they descend alive into Sheol, then you will understand that these men have spurned the Lord. And so, as we know, that's exactly what happened. The ground opened up and they fell alive into death. Now, you could try to say, well, they just hit their head somewhere on the lay down and then they died. But the wording there is interesting because it's clearly going out of its way to say they are alive when they go into death, which is a fascinating way to phrase it. So, we know that this phrase, the abyss, or Sheol, or death, is used a lot in the Old Testament, and we've seen it used in the New Testament, but there's one other place that we see it referenced in the New Testament, and a different word is used. That is in Luke 16. The rich man and Lazarus and rich man both die, and the rich man wakes up or opens his eyes in torment because he is in Hades. Now, Hades being the Greek term referencing death, obviously we know the term Hades from Greek mythology, but it is used here. The term here is referencing judgment that follows death. It is used to put into view the place that the sinner goes upon death. So we might use the word hell. Now, the problem I have with using the word hell is we tend to use the word interchangeably. So hell is not one destination per se. You could apply it depending on the context in which you're using, but there's really two destinations that you could end up. So if you are unsaved and you die, like our rich man, the first place you're going to go is not the throne of God. The first place you go is not some place where they open up a book and see if your name's there. You don't go into the gates of heaven and there's St. Peter waiting to see if your name's on the list. You're like the rich man, you wake up there. You wake up in hell immediately. The wording there is very violent and it's very graphic. The idea is he opened his eyes is more of a astonishment. It's almost like if you were jolted awake. And so he opens his eyes in shock because he's been woken up by something. So he was a rich man. He died in comfort. So you could picture him in his nice comfy deathbed and he's fading off. And then all of a sudden he's woken up. He's jolted up because he's on fire. And this is what he says, that he's in agony in these flames because he is in Hades or Hades, or the place where people go after death. This could be used interchangeably with Sheol in certain contexts, or the abyss, because it is a place that is dark, it is a place that is far away, it is the depths. So there's already interesting use cases there of the term, of what's going on, but then his description that he is in torment. This is the description of why he wakes up, and this is what he explains he is at when he's asking for his brothers to be warned that they may not come to this place of torment. So people apparently have fallen alive there, and so the idea is pretty simple. Where is hell? Where is death? It's not the lake of fire that's being imbued here. That is currently empty. That is waiting. That we don't see until the very end. But the current location you could view more as the jail cell, as the holding cell prior to the day of judgment. So where is it? And I could not find almost anything that would contradict the conclusion that it is underneath us, that it is down below. If you look, and I did some research on this question, we generally think we understand what is in the center of the earth. You have the earth's core. But a lot of that is speculative because we really don't have the ability to go that far down. So the center of the earth is roughly 1,400 miles down. The USSR, the Soviet Union, infamously tried to dig as far down as they possibly could. And they got to a certain depth where it got so hot that their tools started melting, malfunctioning, and the material started to already change because of the heat, and they had to stop. So the center of the earth is 1,400 miles. How far down do you think they made it? 7 miles, or approximately, I believe it was 0.2% down the way. And it already was too hot for them to get down there. And I just thought, okay, well, that's interesting. And it was so interesting and so relevant to the question of hell that when they sealed up the door, they called it, at least one of the terms that I'd seen going around, was the entrance to hell. Ironically, they threw that title on because it was too hot, and they figured, well, we got about as close as we could get, and they shut the door and called it a day. And then the Soviet Union collapsed and nobody tried again. So that's already interesting enough. And we know that fire is underneath. This is what causes volcanic activity, is there is a lot of heat not too far down underneath where we stand. But it would also explain why Korah, when he falls with his group, fall alive into hell. Effectively, the door opens up and they fall. And based on my rough math, it would take them approximately at terminal velocity about 45 minutes to get from the surface down to the center. So when it says they fell alive into Sheol, or they fell alive into death, it means that they fell straight in. So that's already some interesting nightmare fuel. But where is this scene in Revelation 9 occurring? Okay, so if the abyss is referencing the same thing, if it's referencing an entrance to hell, well, where is he? Is it spiritual? Well, it's on the earth. Because when the angel goes and opens the door, what's one of the descriptions? Smoke comes billowing out, and it obscures the sun and the air. In other words, it pollutes the air and blocks off the sun because it's a really dark and large smoke cloud. So the sun, unless you're speculating this is on a different planet, would presume to be on the earth, especially within the surrounding context. On top of the fact that it says the angel himself fell to the earth, so the entrance in view here is seen on the planet, on the earth. The exact location is not specified in this text. However, based on everything that has already happened, we can assume that the entrance was revealed during all of the stuff that's been going on earlier. So, for example, in the sixth seal, there was a great earthquake to such an extent that mountains are literally moved out of their places. So, could be under a mountain. Or, my favorite speculation, after Yellowstone blows up, there's the door. But that's just fun speculation. I just think it's cool because there's a lot of smoke and it would be neat, but that's just me throwing out a guess there. Either way, the entrance is seen on the earth. And with the understanding that this is mere speculation, it is possible that this entrance is revealed after the trumpets are blown. So we already saw something like a mountain being thrown into the sea, and explained how the description of that mountain fits pretty well with the volcanic eruption. So it could be that basically the lid was taken off and thrown into the ocean, and that would make sense. Then the next thing we see in the next chapter is the door. And so the angel comes down from heaven now that the door is there, and he's given the key, and he's ready to open it up. Again, speculation, but I think hard to fight speculation. So then that goes on to our next question. What's inside? What happens when the door is opened? Well, quite simply, it is hell. Or more specifically, Hades, which the rich man wakes up in Luke 16. In that text, the rich man clearly laments the agonizing heat. I am in agony in these flames. And that's why he asks that Lazarus can go and dip his pinky or finger into water and put it on his tongue so that he be relief. He is in agonizing heat, in flame and in fire. And this is consistent with God's judgment that there would be heat, that the current heavens and the earth are reserved for fire. Fire is a regular pattern with God's judgment. So, in there is immense heat. He laments the heat. And many agree, and I'm not alone in the speculation, that this entrance goes into hell. So, in case you think this is just me taking a left field, the debate that would go on is where it might be, but what's inside the hole is undebatable. That it goes down to hell. So many agree that this is what it is in. So, a quick summation of Hades, or the initial holding cell. So if you were to be in your sin and you were, like the rich man, to die, what would happen? Well, the first thing you'd experience is it's hot. Shocking. You go there immediately after death. The rich man's description is there was no gap between when he closed his eyes in death and when he woke up in hell. There was no he woke up and there's God saying, oh, you got to go down that one. Doesn't happen. Just wakes up there. There's no formal trial. There's no proceeding. There's no question. In fact, the Lamb's book of life is not opened until after the current heaven and earth are destroyed, after the millennial reign. So there's none of that. You're just immediately there. Right away, wake up, that's it. So it's immediate. There is no way out. At least not for the inhabitant. What was interesting is it doesn't say, sorry, there's no door. What was said when the angel, or when Abraham was speaking with him, is he specifically mentions that there was a chasm fixed between hell and heaven so that people could not cross over either way. So for some reason, and now we really get into the speculative territory, Abraham was able to be seen with Lazarus, and the rich man was able to see them. Now it doesn't say heaven. The only term that's used about where Lazarus was going was Abraham's bosom or Abraham's side. In other words, Abraham was going to carry him. And this was common for the Jews to believe heaven would be like, because they would be with wherever Abraham was. But it never mentions heaven. Never at any point do we follow Lazarus. All we do is we follow the rich man into hell. He wakes up, he looks up, and he can see them carrying off. In fact, it would seem, based on that text, that the transition of the believer from death into heaven is not immediate, because we can see there, and I've talked about this before, first, the rich man sees Lazarus being carried off by the angels, so he's being transported. The rich man, instantaneous. They appear to have died at the same time. He wakes up and he's already in hell. You could say it didn't take him very long to get there. Then he looks up and he sees Lazarus being carried off. This is similar to when, say, Elijah, he didn't die, but there came the chariots down and he stepped on and went into heaven. So there seems to be some sort of delay there, but for the rich man there isn't. And there is a chasm, there is a gap, there is a great distance that is specifically fixed to prevent the inhabitant of hell from getting out, or at least the victim, the prisoner. You can't get out. Once you're there, that's it. You're now waiting. Now, they will get out. We see at the very end of Revelation in chapter 20, death and Hades are emptied. They're poured out before the throne of God, before Christ, and the books are open, and he judges them before the throne of the lake of fire. So they will be taken out. They're not there forever. So there's a chasm, there's a gap. It's the holding cell for the unbeliever and for demons, apparently, until Christ orders their transfer to the lake of fire. Because the lake of fire, when it is described there at the great white throne of judgment, is described as being designed for the devil and his angels. And anyone whose name is not found written in the book of life is thrown in where their torment goes up day and night forever. So you can kind of see how these things are starting to connect here. And then finally, the flames are described not just by the rich man, but if you read here in Revelation 9, it says when he opens the door, there comes out smoke, and it looks like the smoke of a great furnace. And we've seen that word used, the word furnace, before. Jesus uses the word furnace. In fact, in Matthew 13:42 and verse 49, when it's talking there, he says, after the tribulation and after everything that goes down, so it will be that at the end of the age, the angels will come forth and take out the wicked from among the righteous, and will throw them into the furnace of fire. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And so, in other words, Christ comes again, and he sends out the angels, and they start gathering the unbelievers from among the righteous. So the righteous aren't going anywhere. It's the unrighteous, and he picks them up and throws them into the furnace of fire, which should in this case be Hades that's in view there. So, there's the abyss, there's the king of the abyss. Now we can talk about the locust. Because the door is opened up and smoke comes billowing out, but the smoke is just the pressure release as the lid is taken off. Now comes the creepy part. I titled these God's Torturers. So with the understanding of what the abyss is, you can start to get an idea of how rough it will be when the door is opened to unleash these locusts onto the earth. So the first question I would like to address is whether or not these are demons. This is commonly believed that this is really having demons in views, and I don't think that is the case. While the demons are seen going to the abyss to be tortured, so for example, we see the rich man say, I am in agony in these flames, and keep my brothers from coming to this place of torment. And the rich man woke up in torment. The same word, torment, is used by the angels or by the demons when Jesus comes to cast them out, and they say, you have not come to torment us before the time. And so the same torment goes for the unbeliever, the rich man, as it does the demon. So they're in torment. So we don't ever see demons being let out. That was what I took note of here, that at no point are demons ever mentioned as being unleashed. They are bound, actually, as Peter says, and they are kept there until the day of judgment. So the idea that God is opening the door of hell and letting out demons, to me, just does not add up. So while the demons are seen going there to be tortured, there is no indication that they are ever let out prior to the lake of fire. There is also nothing saying that God cannot have angelic beings at his disposal for the exact purpose of torturing his enemies. So for the people who think, well, look what they do, God wouldn't do that, I beg to differ. Considering everything else he's already done, I have no hesitation to say that these are gods and not the devils. I mean, technically everything is gods, but you know what I mean categorically. And finally, the text does not call them demons. It just doesn't call them demons. So if they're not demons, what are they? Well, here's the next question. Is this literal or is this figurative? Are these representation? Does the hair of the woman represent their elegance, and the face of the man, their ferocity, and the teeth, their gnashing authority? And you could just see people going all over the place with this one. Again, it does not say that. It's a descriptive text, but it does not give answers to that description, except for the tail, and we'll get to that in a second here. So, is this literal or figurative? And I lean more towards literal, mainly because there is nothing in the text that mandates it be figurative. The only figurative thing that's used, the term, so for example, like a or as a, is used to describe the similarities of different parts of their description. So for example, it doesn't say they have the hair of a woman, it says they have a hair like a woman. Or they look like horses prepared for battle, or they have a tail that looks like a scorpion. But that does not mean the whole thing is figurative. It's simply trying to give a likeness to their description. Similar to when the prophets see angels of the cherubim in the throne room, they're trying to give the closest representation that we're familiar with to give you an idea of what they're looking at. That does not mean the thing they're looking at is inherently figurative. It just means they're trying to describe it in a way you can understand, because what they're looking at is unfamiliar. And we are very familiar with this. If you go deep down into the ocean, into the place where light barely shines, if at all, you're going to find weird-looking fish. And what's the first thing you're going to try to do if you went deep down into the ocean, into an abyss, like the pit, and you found some weird, freaky-looking fish, and you came back up to the surface, and you weren't able to get a picture of it, so you tried to describe it. What are you going to do to describe it? Well, it looks like this. Well, think of this. It's kind of like that. So that's really just what's happening here. It does not mandate that the whole thing is now representative, because if it is representative of something, good luck figuring out what that is, because I have no idea, and I don't know how you're going to get an answer as to what they represent. So one of my biggest hesitations with taking something as figurative is even if you're going to try to cross that line, you now have to give me a rule that I can use to carry into other texts to explain whether or not they're figurative, and then how are you going to tell me what they represent, what they mean? And at that point, it just becomes fair game and anybody's guess. But that means you're now arguing to be inconclusive, which this text is just not doing here. So if we were to take it plainly, what would we find? In that case, if they're literal, they appear either to be some sort of specific angel, or perhaps they may be better categorized as a sort of animal. After all, God has used a donkey to speak to Balaam. He used a bear to destroy the mockers of Elisha, and he used serpents to poison and kill the Israelites. So it isn't unusual for God to task natural creatures to carry out judgment. This isn't new. In fact, he has used locusts literally on more than one occasion. For example, in Egypt, he used locusts to go, and this tends to fit within the word pestilence. So locusts aren't uncommon to be used, for example. However, these would be some freaky-looking bugs if they are literal. That is the best word I can use to describe it, because I don't know what else to describe them as. Though, that is perfectly fitting, considering the apocalyptic scene. There's a lot of things that will be unprecedented, that are comparable, but unprecedented. So, for example, you know what an earthquake is, you know what a forest fire looks like. You've never seen ones like these. You've seen locusts, but you've never seen ones like these. So it would make sense, considering the apocalypse going down, you'd have some weird-looking bugs show up. That's not, in other words, my point with that is it's just not outside of the realm of possibility. Nothing looks normal anymore at this point. And so it isn't going to get easier to digest what's going on. The farther you get into Revelation, I hate to break it to you, it's going to get harder. So we've already seen a third of the ocean dead. So there you are at the seashore, and there's blood everywhere, and shipwrecks, and dead animals, dead fish everywhere, and the forests are burned up. Nothing's normal. Nothing's going back to normal at that point. So we're well past that point as a mandate. It should also be noted that the locusts are mentioned by Joel in the context of the day of the Lord, though whether or not he is speaking of these in particular, or just of generic pestilence, well, that's up for debate. But Joel mentions locusts, and that I thought was interesting. But what do they look like? Now here's where we get to the memorable part, and this is where we'll start to tie up our loose ends here. The most memorable text, or most memorable part of the text, this is what most people think of when they think of Revelation and locusts, as they think of these things. So, the first part is they look like a locust. In other words, they're not likely much larger than normal locusts. And they evidently bear the ability to fly. Locusts are also notorious for their ability to cover a large amount of land with a distinctively sweeping effect on the areas they cross through. So in Africa, a few years ago, there were swarms of locusts going around and destroying just thousands of acres of farmland and crops. And so it kind of gives you an idea of what their behavior will be like. So there's that. They look like horses prepared for battle. This would seem to indicate either that their posture is very daunting. In other words, they look more like a horse charging in as opposed to idle. So it could be referencing their posture. Or it could indicate that their bodies and legs resemble a horse more than they do a locust. Again, you can speculate. This is why I didn't bring any sort of presentation, because I don't know what to put here. I tried a few different AI image generators, and they couldn't make up their mind either. So if AI can't, I suppose I'm exempt. We'll know it when we see it. They have crowns of gold on their heads. It would seem to indicate that these aren't literally crowns, as much as they are something that looks like a golden crown. This could indicate that they have either something as simple as a golden stripe around the top of their head, which reflects light, Or it could be indicating that these are sent from the king of heaven, they belong to him. So you could do it like a stamp or a seal, that these are from the king, and so they wear things that look like crowns. They go either way. I'm not going to go too far into that one. They have faces like men. Now this is, I think, where you really start to get creepy. Okay, so locusts, might not like them, but we're familiar with them. All right, there's a golden band around the top of their head. Okay, so they look a little distinct. They're charging like horses into battle. Okay, that we kind of get an idea on. But faces like men, this is where it's hard to try to picture. Similar to how we would say an ape or a gorilla have faces like men. That's why there's a lot of the theories going around. They look like people. They have similar structure. So you could say something similar to that. They have faces like men. They don't have the faces of men. These are not human beings. They're just similar. This is not to indicate that they are actually human, as much as it is to say that their faces look like human faces without being human. Tied to the other attributes, this would make them quite haunting, mostly because there would be something vaguely familiar. In other words, if one flies up to your face before it stings you to torment you for 5 months, that's where we get what's called, in the field of special effects, you call the uncanny valley, where it's not exactly like the representation, but it's not extremely fake. It's somewhere in between where it's hauntingly familiar and it looks somewhat familiar, but it's not exactly the thing, and that's what makes it creepy. They have the hair like a woman, or, in other words, long hair. While some bugs have hair on them, think spiders, while some bugs have hair on them, these appear to have a notably longer length of hair on them. So, again, I'm not going to go into speculation about that one. It seems pretty straightforward to me. And they have teeth like lions, and this one I thought was interesting. Teeth like lions. So, in other words, locusts are usually known for eating vegetation. Lions are known for being predators. They eat meat. So these locusts have teeth that are not as much designed for vegetation as much as they are for meat, similar to a lion. So you could say either that this is representative of the fact that they are predators, or you could say that their teeth were designed to eat something other than vegetation. They are large and they are sharp, and these are meant to tear into flesh and bone and clearly indicates that these are predators. Unlike normal locusts, which eat vegetation, vegetation is the one thing they're told not to touch. So you could view that as a command, as though they want to, but they're not allowed to, or it could be that's not what you're after that. And of course, their one target is people. However, they're not allowed to kill people. They're specifically given the instruction not to kill anyone, just to torment them. Then they're seen as having breastplates similar to iron. And I thought this was fascinating, because if you were one of the inhabitants of the earth, and these freaky-looky bugs are coming around, and you're starting to realize that if it gets at you and it stings you, you're going to be in torment for 5 months, one of the things you might try to do is fight back. Here they're seen as having armor, more specifically breastplates, which is one of the predominant pieces of armor, second to a helmet, that one would wear. And it's similar to, as it's described here, something like iron. In other words, you could view it either as a sort of exoskeleton because it's a bug, or because of the distinctive fact that it's mentioned here, they are effectively being equipped to resist the resistance of the victim. So here the humanity is trying to swat them away or shoot them out of the sky or whatever it is they're going to try to do, and the bugs have been equipped accordingly. In other words, you're not going to be able to fight back, at least not very easily. So how terrifying would it be to have such a weird, terrifying, hauntingly familiar-looking insect flying rapidly towards you, and it's armored up? And the wings make a distinctive sound similar to chariots. It is a loud or collective volume of humming and buzzing, which resembles a large group of horses or chariots rather than mere insects. So in other words, as far as I can tell, it appears to move a lot of air. So one of the reasons chariots would have a distinctive sound in battle is because there's a lot of them, so there's a heavier mass, and they're stomping on the ground, and you'd hear it from farther away, and you'd feel it. In this case, these things are flying, so I think it's just natural side effect. So you could say that they might sound similar to more of a helicopter. In other words, you have such a rapid movement of air and in a large collective that it's going to sound very loud and daunting. And then finally, they have tails like scorpions. This is their primary weapon, and they are given a stinger which is specifically set up to poison men but not to kill them. This is interesting when you recall the fact that they are told not to kill men, so their sharp teeth are to instill terror, not to kill people. And if these come from hell, it isn't a stretch to assume that their poison from their tails injects the victim with a supernatural burning feeling, which would be similar to what some scorpion stings could be like. Thus the use of the word torment, which is very similar to the same word used by the rich man in Luke 16. In other words, you're getting a small injection or sample of hellfire, quite literally. And then finally, the angel of the abyss is their king. They are not independent. They're not free-thinking. They answer to someone. They're not acting on their own. And he's likely the one who rounds them up when they're done. And so they don't answer to the devil. So what do? We'll quick fly over here. They are clearly sent out as torturers, with their effective goal to make a true hell on earth. They are effectively bringing a sample of hell down to the face of the earth. They are traveling to earth, and there is no restriction given to them. In fact, they are specifically described as being on the earth, so this is clearly a thing that we'll be able to see. And they target anyone who does not have the mark of God on their foreheads. In other words, anyone who is not Christ is fair game. They are told not to harm the grass, likely because it's allowing time for it to regrow, because all of it was destroyed in the previous chapter. They are told not to harm any other green thing, including trees, most likely to allow either food for those who have the seal of God on their foreheads, so they're leaving room for food, or just to allow people not to starve to death so they can live longer to feel the pain. And they're not allowed to kill anyone, meaning they have the ability, just not the permission. So they will get as close as they can to death without crossing the line, and then when people want to go death and they try to kill themselves, death runs away. Death is not allowed, because again, and this is where we will end, who holds the keys to death? It's not the devil, it's not the locusts, and not even this angel. We see Jesus at the very beginning of the book, and he holds the keys to death and Hades, and that's why John is told not to be afraid, because the one who could kill him and throw him into hell is not going to. That doesn't mean he doesn't use the keys. Jesus said in John 10 that no man has authority to take his life. No one could take even his earthly life. They weren't allowed to. When Jesus died, he gave it up himself, and he took it up again. He voluntarily let it down, and he voluntarily picked it back up. So if the one who has the keys to death and can come and go into life as he pleases targets you, that means that no matter what your best efforts are, he can keep you from achieving death. So that would have a side effect. If you tried to kill yourself and you weren't allowed to die, it means you're going to deal with whatever the side effects are of your effort without the apparent relief of death. But on top of this, even if they were to die, they would still end up at the place they were just sampling. So there's no way out. In other words, you're cornered. This is just not great. And how long does it last? 5 months. This goes on for 5 months of this. And we'll get into this more next time. But this is called the first woe. You have the woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants on the earth because of the remaining trumpets, and this is just the first sampling. So you've already lived through fire burning up the trees, you've already lived through the ocean being turned to blood, and water supply disappearing, and 2 billion people are dead, and you've lived through all of this. And now you get to either experience this, or you get to know someone who's experiencing it. Either way, to put it visually or audibly, the screams and suffering and torment of hell are now coming up to the surface. And again, this is just partway through. We're not even there yet. This is just the introductory sample. So, when you see perverts in the news, baby killers running for president, evil people doing evil things, and they're mocking God, God is not mocked. And as Peter said, and as I've iterated many times before, he's not slow, he hasn't forgotten. And so when you look at people who are doing these things, recognize they're only doing it because they have been given time to do so. But that time will run out, either when they die or when death comes here, when hell makes its way up to the surface. So if anything, that should invoke pity, because whether or not your favorite candidate wins the election is of no particular relevance at this point in time. Once it gets there, doesn't matter. You're going to forget the election because there are plenty of other things going on that are going to remind you that this is not only not our home, it's not theirs anymore either. That they don't want to be here any more than anybody else. So with that uplifting note, let's pray. Thank you, Father, for the brief glimpse into the future, but also the brief glimpse into what you have spared us from. That, like John, if left on our own, we would also fall like the dead men that we would be. That we would be terrified of these things just like them. And I thank you that the reason we don't have to be is not because of us, but because you have the keys to these things. You have the keys to the doors, and you have the keys to death and everything that we fear, and that you yourself have told us we don't have to. I thank you that we are not of the darkness nor of the night, and we don't have to fear these things, but that we can follow your instruction to look up and realize that these things are happening because our redemption is drawing near. So I ask that we look at the evil in the world and the things that you permit to go on and realize why you permit them, that you are patient and that you give us time and you give them time. But I also thank you that you also have a conclusion to this. We thank you for these things and ask that they keep us sober, for it's in Jesus' name we get to pray them. Amen.